All right, well, it's 8 o'clock, the start of our webinar. At the top of the hour, we're going to go ahead here. Want to welcome everyone to our white mold management webinar. We've got a great lineup today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you can kindly mute your phones, you'll see there should be a mute function on the top right-hand side. There should be camera mic. Just hit the mic and mute that, please. If you have questions, please use the chat line. There's a chat function there. We'll be monitoring that throughout. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll open it up for questions so you can unmute yourself and ask questions from the speakers. I would also ask, a lot of times we get questions at the end when the webinar is over. Kindly reach out to your Pioneer sales representative or your Corteva crop protection retailers if you got questions. And then finally, there's a bunch of folks that have the certified crop advisor. We'll have at the end a code that you can scan basically and get credits for today's webinar. So we got three keynote speakers. I'm Paul Hermans. Most of you probably know me. I live in the Ottawa Valley area just outside of Ottawa. Agronomist for Pioneer. I'll be kind of the moderator and also presenting today. We got Marc Maisonneuve, the Maize Man we call him. He's a territory manager with Corteva living in the Ottawa area as well. And then we got a great guest speaker, Evelyn Valera Rojas. She is a soybean breeder. You can see her here cutting a cake with her famous Z series soybeans, and she's from down in the Woodstock area. So we got three experts, panelists here today to talk to you about white mold. So we're going to review white mold, what the disease is. We're going to talk a little bit about agronomic strategies for management, and then focus quite a bit on an upcoming fungicide application ideas. That's just around the corner here. And then give you some forward-thinking ideas of where we're going from a research standpoint with Corteva and Pioneer looking at white mold management. And then at the end, again, ask some questions, and then hopefully adjourn around 9 o'clock, give or take. So before we get into it, I want to see if folks are alive today and paying attention. We're going to run some polls throughout the webinar just to get a feel of where you're at. So I'm going to run the first poll here. And the first one, it says basically, do you currently use fungicides as part of your management practices? Yes, for soybeans only. Yes, for corn only. Yes, both corn and beans. No, not yet, but I want to see if there's value in applying a fungicide basically from a bean standpoint. So you just kind of click on the button there, hit the submit, and then we'll see kind of a generality where the folks that are on the line here today are at. I'll give it another 20 seconds or so here. See where we're at. So again, it's something that you can, if you're online on your computer, iPad, you should be able to respond. And so far we have most folks. I'm going to hit the done button and just do a little quick summary here. Most folks picked yes for both corn and beans. And then we got about a quarter that are just soybeans only, a quarter that are corn only, and then about 20% that have not or do not use a fungicide at all. So I'm going to close the poll. That's good to see. Good information there. So I'm going to turn it over to Evelyn. She can talk a little bit more about white mold, the disease, and what it does from a management standpoint, or basically how it affects soybeans in your crop on your farm.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here this morning talking about one of the most important diseases for Eastern Canada. This disease is very close and dear to my heart. I've been working with white mold on soybeans for about a good 14 years now, almost 15, since I came to Canada from Cuba. And the complexity of the disease, the complexity of the pathogen just makes it more enticing for me to keep studying and learning more about it. So the first line there in the slide, that's the scientific name of the pathogen, so sclerotinia sclerotiorum, and the name derives from one of the structures that the fungus utilizes to survive, to overwinter. We'll see that in a couple of minutes in a slide. The fungus infects more than 400 species of plants worldwide. You've probably heard about sunflower, canola, dry beans, soybeans. So it causes significant damage to yield and grain quality, and it's a pathogen that feeds off of a dying or dead tissue, and that's why it's called necrotrophic pathogen. The white mold disease, if we take a look at, I just brought a couple of tables that I borrowed from the USDA crop protection publication. Is data for 2021. I couldn't find anything more recent, but it depicts the idea that I wanted to share with you guys, and is that the losses of caused by white mold or sclerotinia stem rot, that's another name for the disease, back in 2021 was estimated around 27 million bushels just for soybeans in the United States and in Ontario. So I had highlighted Ontario. Oh, I have highlighted Ontario there in the graph on your left. And I also wanted to point out when they did a survey on diseases, they classified them in stem diseases, leaf diseases, and so forth. So for the stem diseases, sclerotinia stem rot, white mold came at the top of their list. So it was the most devastating disease back in that year. But I also want to point out that sudden death syndrome comes at a close second there. And so does charcoal rot and Phytophthora. So even though this seminar is focused on white mold, there are other stem and foliar diseases that are very important for this part of our geography. So the infection, how does the pathogen infects the plant? So as you can see in that picture at the bottom, I have highlighted those black structures that can be observed on the surface of the stem of the plants. Those are called sclerotia, and they are hyphal aggregates. So if you look at the white mycelia at the top of one of those circles, that white mycelia with time becomes sclerotia, and that's how the pathogen can remain viable in the ground or in residues for up to 8 years. Now, that sclerotia can germinate, and that's how the infection starts. So the germination occurs via apothecia formation, and the apothecia are those like champagne flute or champagne cup structures that are observed on the soil or on debris. But it can also happen that the germination of the sclerotia occurs via mycelia. You can give it another click there. Yes. So whenever the sclerotia germinates into apothecia, then that's when, given the exact conditions, environmental conditions of high relative humidity and sort of, actually for the range of temperature, it doesn't necessarily, it can germinate at a wide range between 4 and 32 degrees Celsius, but that discharge of that cloud that you see on the second picture in the middle, those are the spores that are released from those structures, and those are the spores that then will land on the tissue. So if you can note on the left side of that cycle, after the dispersal of the spores, then those spores land on dying or dead flowers. That's why it's so important to monitor the crop and to be vigilant, because that's when the infection might start to take. And from there, then the mycelia starts to colonize the plant. So it just goes from those internodes into the stem, into the petiole, the leaves, and then the whole plant gets colonized. Also, there is transmissions of the disease from plant to plant. So just by contact of one plant to the other, the infection can then pass on to the plant that is decided. And I will talk about the symptoms in a little bit, but I just wanted to highlight here in the cycle that that plant then dies. So that's the fundamental thing that the pathogen will do to the plant. Then the survival structures will appear on the surface of the plant, inside the plant. And that's how the fungus overwinters. And then the following summer, you get the infection all over again, unless there is rotation. But even with rotation, with soybean, wheat, and corn, you get that those structures survive more than 5 years. So chances are your crop is going to get infected again. Now, talking a little bit about the symptoms on the next slide. I try to put as many pictures as possible to sort of highlight the main symptoms you might find. So the mycelia that will cover the leaves and stem on the left there, those are like very noticeable when you're walking the field. Sclerotia body, so you can find inside the pith or outside on the surface of the plant. Excuse me, lesions on the stem that might appear water soaked. Also, the stem might appear bleached. You see that at the end of the season, your plants are going to look sort of like that picture at the bottom there on the left. I think that's Paul walking one of the impact sites in 2023. We took a few pictures. But yeah, your plants are going to look like that. So the leaves are going to still be hanging on the plants. And typically, once the soybean matures, all the leaves they fall, right? But in the case of dead plants at this point, they are going to look like that. And if you click another time, Paul.
Just someone on the phone, Evelyn. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Feedback.
So at the bottom, in the center of the slides, if you have taken a pod from an infected plant, that's more or less how they look like. You might find sclerotia inside in place of the seeds. And if you find seeds, then they're going to look all wrinkled and flattened. So that's the year loss just right there. I have purposely put those two pictures in the center of the slides because oftentimes walking the fields, I've had people asking me, is this the structure that, the white mold structure? And it's actually what they call bird's nest fungi. So it's a little bit bigger than the actual apothecia or the structure that will cause the white mold disease. And it's also like if you touch it, it's sort of like lignified, so it's harder. I found this on the Crop Protection Network website that is cited at the bottom of the slide, and I decided to just bring it over for us to take a peek. So I believe after symptoms, you can click again. Paul, I just wanted to, without getting into many details, this is not the seminar for this, but I wanted to mention what we are doing at Corteva to sort of tackle this important task. We understand the complexity of the disease. We also understand that there is no resistant variety available. Because of the nature of the disease, we talk about susceptibility and tolerance. We don't talk about resistant varieties. So I have a couple of lines there that I picked out of one of our disease nurseries that we have across North America. We have designated disease screening nurseries to evaluate our experimentals before they go out and become commercial products. In those nurseries, we replicate each of the lines anywhere between 4 to 6 times, and these nurseries are a compound of inoculated and naturally occurring nurseries, and we take manual scores on each and every line that is planted. We have checks in there, so we use this phenotypic observation to produce the scores that then you will see in the seed catalog. But we also take advantage if there are opportunities to collect scores in impact sites or our yield trials. We go there as well and we collect the data. And the score that you will see on your catalog is it's a product of these observations plus what we call genetic estimated breeding values. So we have a strong prediction pipeline that we feed with these phenotypic scores plus the genetic information of the lines, and we produce what we call a predictive value of how the line will behave, and we sort of mix this GEBV with the phenotypic observation and then produce the scores that you guys will see on the seed catalog. I think with this, I will turn it over to Paul, and he will continue.
Great, thanks, Evelyn. And I see, folks, there's a couple of questions in the chat or Q&A. We're going to get to those at the end. Keep putting them in there. Just want to let you know if you put them in there, we do see them, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. So one of the key things that I'm involved with Evelyn is doing research and looking at products before you folks grow or see them on the market. This is an NDVI score from a drone from an impact plot, and I'm just going to set it up. You can see in the center here, we got kind of like a checkerboard pattern. Basically, each one of these squares is 8 rows wide by 40 feet long, so we have a bunch of different products. The red on the outside is what the farmer grew in this area. It was planted about a week earlier. So we're getting close to senescence time, and that's why this is showing up red. But more interestingly, inside the box, you can see we got certain squares that are red, and this is in 2022. We had a lot of white mold, and these blocks basically are experimentals that have more mold. So basically, we're going to be pitching it and taking those products and throwing them out, not bringing them to the market. So we do a lot of research, especially for mold in Eastern Ontario and Quebec, looking at that, and that's what part of Evelyn and the research team does. So I just wanted to show you that from an impact perspective. Then with that coming forward, we're going to have our new Z-Series beans. So that's our new lineup of Enlist soybeans. They're on average about 2.7 bushels better than our A-Series beans. We have the offensive yield, but then also the defensive traits, which I think is a win-win. And if you look in the white mold columns with the Z-Series beans, we have at least a score of 5 or better for white mold tolerance. Now, we go through a scale of 1 through 9, 9 being perfect. We don't have any 9 varieties. There is no 100% resistant varieties on the market, but I like what we're doing from a standpoint of basically a 5, 6, and we do have actually one variety, this P06A38E, that is a 7. So most of our ones, if you're looking to pick varieties out there, I would look for a 5, 6 score. and that's going to give you a good variety from a white mold tolerance standpoint. So there's one thing I just want to talk about, the disease triangle, and whether it's with white mold, northern corn leaf blight, tar spot, it doesn't matter. We need three different things to occur. We need to have the environment. So that's, in this case, down in the canopy, lots of humidity, moisture to get the fruiting bodies to release the spores. We need that pathogen to be there, and then we need a susceptible host or variety. In this case, would be soybeans. So you can see here on the left-hand side, we got a susceptible hybrid or variety. On the right-hand side, we have a resistant one that doesn't have as much disease in this overall triangle here, and that's what we call the disease triangle. So there's differences between the susceptible are going to get the white mold a lot more than a resistant type of a hybrid or variety. Now, last year in 2023 in Eastern Ontario was probably one of the worst white mold years that we had. And if we think about the environment, what I have here is a weather station in the Richmond area looking at, this is nighttime temperatures on the bottom, daytime temperatures on the top, and basically in that, 25 to 27, 18, 25, 27. So warm conditions, basically, that is really conducive for white mold to occur. And then if you top it on with rainfall, again, I've got June up top here, and then July, we were getting in through June, and we're getting towards the end of June, hardly any rain. I thought, man, we're not going to see much white mold. But then towards the end of June, we got rain. And then in July, almost every 3 or 4 days, we kept that canopy really saturated with moisture, high humidity. So you put that all together, and that was one of the main reasons with that disease triangle that we had so much white mold in the 2023 growing season. Again, if we don't, if we go into July, hot and dry, no moisture, that's going to reduce that disease triangle, and there's going to be less chance of having white mold going forward. So one other thing I wanted to point out, and this was neat, we were on a webinar yesterday with another soybean breeder, but basically if you take a look at from starting at a planting date, so here's May 1st, flowering begins on your soybeans roughly between 750 to 800 growing degree units. That's in a Fahrenheit standpoint. So we can, put in a start date, kind of get a rough idea of when the soybeans are going to flower. A bit of differences here. That's going to be differences in terms of maturity of flowering, but for most of us in Ontario and Quebec, that 750, 800 growing degree units would be an indication of when flowering should start. And then canopy closure, if you're on 30-inch rows, roughly about 1,300 growing degree units. Obviously, if I'm on 15s or 7.5, it's going to be earlier. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. And then how do we kind of target R2 spray, fungicide sprays, that kind of thing going forward. So before I switch over into the fungicide management, I'm going to launch the next poll question that we have here for you. Hopefully that's going to show up on your screen. So what is your current management strategy for soybeans? Do you use a one-pass application? Do you use a two-pass application management strategy? Or you do not use fungicide in soybeans at all? Understanding we got differences in folks across on this webinar here. Some folks might not have white mold as much, so they might only be using a one-pass. But I would assume that most people, if you're in a white mold situation, would be using a two-pass management strategy. So again, if you could just submit what you're doing on your farm and kind of give us a sense on where you're at. And then that'll set the stage for Marc Maisonneuve here next in a few seconds. So far, most of the people are doing 53% is a one-pass application, and then about 20% two-pass, and then about another 20% that don't use a fungicide. So Marc, that's going to be your challenge here. That's the folks that don't use the fungicide to show them the value of where that is. All right, so we're going to close the poll, and I'll turn it over to Marc Maisonneuve, Corteva Crop Protection here for Eastern Ontario.
Sounds good, Paul, and my mic is okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, great. No, I think that's a good lead-in, especially when you look at the disease cycle and how things process. There are a couple questions in the chat that, yes, we will deal with, but it does really highlight the fact that the fruiting bodies are the ones that are releasing ultimately through the ascospores, the spores that are infecting flowers, and petals are what we're trying to protect and from a systemic standpoint inside the plant. So I'll start it with Viatude and then move my way into to Acapella, mainly for awareness too, that Viatude was a product that we launched last year. We had obviously a lot of input in the timing of this product. For the most part, Acapella led the way with the initial application at R1.5, R2, and then Viatude, because of its mode of actions, was used as a second pass product. In some case, it was the only product, and again, it will depend on that disease cycle, when it's happening, and the timing within the crop flowering stages, but also the severity of the infection and field history is huge. So the idea around Viatude is to have two modes of action. We added the prothioconazole to the picoxystrobin, which is the Acapella piece. We balanced those rates with the intention that they would complement each other on plant health and some white mold control. We do know that when a lot of this work was done in 21, which was, I would say, an average white mold year, 22 being a lighter than average white mold infestation year, 23 being an absolute explosion in comparison to the last 25 years. So that being said, again, depending on timing, the field history, the infection, certainly it was part of a two-pass program. There was a lot of success with the one pass, but again, when you look at some of the stages as we moved along through the flower into the flowering period, and just to be specific, that R1, you're getting some early blooms. We're starting R1.5 to R2 is where we've already had a week of flowering, some flowers on the top parts of the plant, and we're looking to very much have an application of a fungicide prior to that full R2 bloom stage from our experience in Eastern Ontario. I know that can vary in Western Ontario and other parts, but that's under high infection conditions, weather coupled with history. We're certainly wanting to be on the early side of our applications. Acapellas usually fit that window the best. And Viatude, if it is the only application, has sometimes been used as well. We did have a 2.5 bushel game when we were comparing Viatude over the untreated. And again, a lot of the work was done in 22. We know that is a year in retrospect that was lower in infection and incidence compared to 2023, which was the absolute extreme of white mold infection. So certainly the more infection you have, the timing being right, and the field history, the product will work as accordingly. So of course, there's other products that have 2 modes or 3 modes of action. They usually specifically have 1 or 2 modes that are very much working on the white mold control piece. The other piece being plant health. The nice thing about Acapella is that you have both. If you have look at the effectiveness of the modes of action, picoxystrobin by far is the most effective with a very fast absorption, more redistribution within the plant that helps to protect the stem, and of course especially in the leaf axils where a lot of infection would take place and occur where the leaf petals are falling. So more movement equals more bushels. That movement of Acapella has really been compared over the years. So we've been working very specifically with not only our internal work, but some key crop consultants, retail reps, some of the Pioneer reps that are involved on this webinar today, to see that we've had very good coverage with that initial application. And again, sometimes, sclerotinia is a bit of an art as much as a science, where you've got to gauge it a little bit with the conditions. Yes, there's the flowering period, but if you're going to have good control, good redistribution and coverage within the plant, it just gives you a better chance to get through most of the flowering period. So that high rate of Acapella, we talk about 10 to more like 14 days of coverage. The reality is that we certainly have that, and sometimes and most times in high infection areas, we need that second application. There is even talk of third application. I've seen that question in the chat, and I don't think that's out of the question. But for most of what's been registered, we're looking at labels. Most of the infection period is trying to be controlled within 2 applications and covering most of the flowering period. But either way, the plant health piece is important, where you boost the plant, but not too much, but just enough that you've got good, healthy chlorophyll production within the plant. That is definitely increased with the use of picoxy. Without picoxy, you see a definite decrease and not nearly the same visual effects after a week to 10 days of applying Acapella. When you see the green, healthy leaves that are still trucking along, and we know that a good, healthy organism, much like a human, is much better in fighting off disease in the first place. And then you actually have properties that control white mold with the picoxy and the redistribution within the plant to hold it back. And we want to get through that flowering period because obviously the infection level drops way off. You've seen these bar charts or these piano charts many times. Generally over the years you have to look at a 10 or 20 year spectrum, but more than half the time we're gaining major bushels that are paying for not only the application of the product, but gaining bushels and protecting yield that we want in that potential. There's other years where the infection level or the history of that field is not necessarily as creating as much of a difference, but the mean average still shows that there's a benefit to applying. And there's other years, of course, where you really want to look at your overall potential of your soybean crop. We haven't typically, promoted a lot of Acapella or fungicide use in 25, 30 bushel beans. We're definitely, upwards of 45 to 50 bushel beans. And we know that we can hit parts of the fields that are 85 to 100 bushels. So it's very important to look at that whole scenario and in looking at the advantage of the fungicide, the yield benefits of protecting what you have there, and of course the timing and the use of 2 applications at a minimum to cover that flowering period, especially under high infection areas and field history. So the application of Acapella, obviously we target soybeans a lot. It is registered in other crops and our other main crops. Sclerotinia is the number one focus with picoxy, of course, combined with the prothio in Viatude. You have also some leaf disease management as far as rust and frog eye, leaf spot, and septoria brown spot. The rates, we typically aim for the higher rates if we're talking about white mold control. In Viatude, of course, it's been balanced with the prothio, but we do know under high infection areas and high infection conditions that higher rates are definitely recommended. For white mold, you make that initial preventative application at the early bloom, and when you start to see flowers in that first week, I think it's time to start gearing up the sprayer. We know that within those 7 to 10 days, things can move very quickly as far as the number of flowers and petals, but also if the infection period is also matched with that, then earlier the better as far as your first application goes, and then timing that second application. Depending, it may be 10 to 14, it may be a bit shorter than that, depending on how heavy dews are in the morning. It doesn't take a lot of rain to kind of keep those conditions going with dews in the morning, but also very high humidity. And of course, that's what we often experience in Ontario, in Eastern Ontario. And we are experiencing that right now. We are seeing a reprieve, but we know how conditions can change. And we want to be ready and be proactive and plan your Acapella application, your Viatude application, and be ready for the season. We're certainly there to support you. So I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Marc. And again, folks, I know there's a bunch of questions coming in the chat. I'll go through the rest of the presentation and we'll come back and make sure that we hit all those questions here at the end. So I just wanted to go through a bit of a research agronomy update that we did here in Eastern Ontario in 2023, looking at Viatude 1 pass. We had a bunch of different varieties from 04 up to a group 1.4. Again, differences in white mold scores and differences in locations that we had out in the countryside here. But in general, what we saw with the 1 pass system, similar to what Marc talked about, this piano graph and everything else, but a 3.2 bushel response across the Viatude fungicide versus non-treated. And again, if I take out, probably 70% of the time, it was going to be even 3, 4, 5 bushels or higher. So last year was a really high white mold year in Eastern Ontario. I wanted to point that out. So we did in a couple cases where we did 2 pass system, where we had a single pass versus 2 pass, and we saw almost a 10 bushel difference with that 2 pass system, again, protecting those flowers for a longer period of time, given the year that we had. And a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is a drone shot that we took from up in the sky. What we have in here on the south side, no fungicide. You can see the varieties that have a lower white mold score in the darker red. Then here we have the one-pass system and then the two-pass system, just to give you a sense on what it would do from a plant health standpoint. So again, with that heavy white mold pressure last year, definite advantage to the two-pass system over the one, and the one-pass system definitely had an advantage over using no fungicide at all. So there was differences as we talk about flowering and timing in that whole triangle. This is a sales rep just in North Gore that had 2 adjacent fields planted at 2 different dates, only 5 different dates apart. Again, the same 5 varieties here. And if you look at the differences between applying a fungicide Biotude one pass, in this particular planting date, it was only 0.4 per bushel. The next planting date was 4.5. So on average, a 4 bushel difference is just based on planting date differences. So it's kind of tough to figure out what's going to happen from a white mold strategy. It's kind of like, in a way, insurance for your car. To me, I think I'd want to be putting it on. But again, shows you how that timing and everything of when flowers occurred, when the white mold pressure could have came in, and then when you think it back to those rainfall amounts that we talked about, that all factors into these differences out in the fields that you're going to be working with this year. So I did one other specific trial, just looking at soybean seed size. This was up in Renfrew County where we had 2 replications treated and untreated. On average, it was 5 bushels better for the Biotude, but I then took 3 subsamples of each treatment and weighed 100 seeds just to see what the difference was. And you can see that the treated seed size was 100 100 seeds less per pound than the untreated, so a lot larger seed. Again, we're protecting those flowers, protecting yield, but we're also increasing the seed size of the soybeans when we're using a fungicide, and that all adds up to more yield at the end of the day. So I wanted to point out a couple other things. I know in Ontario and Quebec, we've got such a dramatic planting window here this year. There's probably 3 or 4 different planting dates when you think about soybeans. This was a study that was done looking at duration of growing degree units and different planting dates. So we start here on the end of April through May and then through June. These are late 2 to group 3. So some people in Southern Ontario would be growing this. I know Upper Way we wouldn't, but it still, references the differences in terms of days to R1. So you can see days to reproductive stage. Earlier on, I've got a longer window. I've got a bigger window to create a bigger factory, more branches, more pods and flowers. But this really shortens up as we start to get to later planting dates. Growing degree units to R1, though, only varied by about 100. And again, you think about back April, May, we don't have as much heat. As we're getting more into June and July, we got hotter days, so those growing degree units add up. But again, make reference that 750 to 800, roughly growing degree units to R1 is a guideline to flowering. And then we look at dates from R1 to R6, differences short as you get planted later, basically those days shorten up. So keeping that in mind, again, a lot of different planting dates out there with our beans. We got to keep it, for those earlier ones, if the guys had earlier planted beans, it's time to start looking at those, looking at flowering, what Marc talked about and everything else moving forward. So I'm going to ask another question here. I'm going to launch this poll and see what folks are saying, and then we're kind of almost getting wrapped up, and we'll come to the questions here shortly. So what do you think is the most important management practice for controlling white mold on your farm? Variety selection, fungicide use, crop rotation, row width and population management, or maybe you don't know, and hopefully we'll tell you a few things here as we go on with the webinar. So what do you think is the most important management practice for controlling white mold? Variety selection, fungicide use, crop rotation, row width and population, or don't know? Give it a bit of time here for folks to respond. So we have about, so far, about a third say variety selection, Row width and population management is kind of coming in second, kind of tied with crop rotation, bouncing around here, but it's kind of interesting to see. So I'll come back to the presentation here. So kind of moving forward, I kind of put probably top, 6 or 7 on here. Variety selection, hopefully we showed you definite differences in varieties that we have at Pioneer. I agree with the population management. We're actually doing in Eastern Ontario this year. We're going to have some trials. We got about 20 trials between Toronto and the Quebec border going at 80, 120, 160, and 200,000. And to me, that population management, it's going to depend on a couple things. I take a look at environment. I'm 6'2", so if I have beans up to my waist or chest, I know I'm in a good environment. It's all about having a whole bunch of nodes. So in that case, I can reduce my population because I'm going to have good growth. If I'm in a yield environment that I'm only up to my knees, I don't have as many nodes, so I'm going to increase my population. But looking in generality from a white mold standpoint, white mold for what we do to grow the best beans, it also means we're going to have the highest potential for mold. So population management is one of those things that we can look at. Row width comes into play to a degree. We see more folks going to 30-inch rows earlier on for planting. As we get later in the growing season, especially this year, I'd rather go to a 15-inch row to get that canopy in quicker. Planting date comes into play. If I can plant earlier, and it seems to be that I can get my beans to flower earlier and then kind of miss that key window. Usually we get July, more rain the last few years. That plays into it. And then definitely the fungicide use. Hopefully showed you here with the fungicide. A 1-2 pass system, depending on where you're at, and severity would help with white mold. And then a feasible reduced tillage, no-till. I would say about a third of our impact research sites that we have are on no-till, and we generally see a reduction in white mold. That's because the sclerotinia, they're sitting on top of the surface. They're not getting put back down and then coming up 3 or 4 years later with tillage. So sunlight, insects, bugs, that kind of stuff, reduce that. And then a definite one for sure is crop rotation. We saw that last year where we had some split fields that were beans on beans, bean and corn that were split, even with corn silage being taken off, those different things definitely help. So those are kind of some of the key factors that you can look at to help manage white mold moving forward. So here's food for thought, and this one might seem a little crazy, but you think about your lawn that's around your house. And your lawn grass, basically, it's a shallow rooted crop. But, if your lawn is brown come July 1st, the chances are that white mold will be down. If your lawn is green, chances are that white mold will be keen. Just to kind of give you a sense on where mold will be. And again, that can change dramatically with the weather, but it's kind of a good indicator where the white mold disease would be present. And there are models out there. So there's Forecaster model. It's an app that you can put on your phone. Basically, you go in and you pick a field, you put in your planting date, if it's flowered or not, and it basically kind of zones in on your area, look at the weather and everything else. If flowers are present, so I just did a kind of a mock-up here for June 17th, and it would have a high risk of 74% for that field in my area. Again, it's a different way that you can use models to kind of help you determine white mold and out in the field. So what we're doing, similar research at Corteva and with Pioneer, is doing a soybean fungicide timing model this year. We did this with corn in the U.S. for the last couple of years, and it takes into account basically when you planted the crop, what's the moisture like, rainfall, humidity within the canopy and everything else. That all goes into a model and then kind of predicts when's the best time that we should be spraying for white mold. So in this particular case, we're going to have a grower's going to come in and apply when he thinks he should put down a fungicide. So it could be the acapella. And then we'd say, hey, come back in maybe 2 days earlier, 2 days later with what we think, and then an untreated check, and we're going to take this to yield. So from a corn standpoint, what we saw the last 2 years in the U.S. was about a 4 bushel advantage with the Corteva fungicide timing model going at the proper time. And again, thinking about it from a grower from your standpoint, you can't be everywhere, but what this model will do is kind of give you on your computer or iPad kind of a gauge. Hey, where's the disease at, when it should be out there spraying and everything else. So that's what we're doing from a trial standpoint here in 2024. So stay tuned. We'll have some research data on that here in the fall. And again, I think this stuff was really interesting. It's to help you kind of take away that pain point of when to decide to spray or not. And quite frankly, we're getting with scientific, discoveries and models and everything else that we can predict this very well to help you get the most bang for your buck on your farm. So in summary, and then we'll get to the questions here. White mold, hopefully we showed you, and what Evelyn showed, a lot of different species. It's a complex disease. It can last in the soil for a long time. And it takes a lot of long-term agronomy management basically to help combat this disease. It's not just a one-time, one-year wonder thing. We got many tools to assist with that. We got the fungicide. We talk about planting dates, variety is a key thing, crop rotation, everything else. Keep an eye on the weather and plan for fungicide applications in a timely manner. We do have a good weather stations across all of Ontario and Quebec. You can tie into that and look at rainfall and humidity and all that kind of stuff. And then last thing I would say, by all means, please reach out for assistance. We're here to help you. Talk to your Pioneer sales rep, your Corteva crop protection person, if you need to get chemical, that kind of stuff. And I would say, do you have your Acapella and or Biotude fungicide booked? Time is ticking. It's just around the corner. Things are coming on. I had a customer that's on here today. He sent me a picture yesterday, May 11th, planted beans starting to flower already. So things can move pretty quick out in the field. And to go from that R1 to R2 stage, so R1 again is one flower anywhere on the plant. R2 is a flower within the top two nodes. Takes about 5 days. So it can move pretty quickly out there when we start seeing flowers in the countryside. So before, I guess maybe what we'll do is we'll get to the chat line. Maybe Evelyn and Marc, if you guys can unmute, see if I can get this to work here. The chat line. Bear with me, folks. I'm just going between screens here. Okay, if we go back, will a fungicide control any sclerotia that is on the ground so that it does not move up the plant and affect the plant? So fungicide control, for sclerotia that are on the ground, will it protect it from moving up the plant? Who wants to tackle that one?
I touched base with it on that too, but I would like Evelyn to maybe comment, is that, sclerotia on the ground or within dead trash is basically just a vehicle part ready to release an epithecea or mini golf tees that would then release ascospores into the air under the right conditions. And of course, the right conditions are often within our flowering period. And so the fungicide really plays a part more once it's systemically moving in the plant, like an Acapella or Picoxy, to protect the plant sort of in that stem, branch, and leaf axil level. So that's where the fungicide really comes in. The fruiting body is basically, like I say, part of the disease cycle.
Mm-hmm. And it's a survival structure.
But I would like, Evelyn, if you can comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a survival structure. So I didn't get into much detail, but it's actually, so the outer part of the structure is melanized. So it's very hard and can withstand like extreme temperatures and changes. So what I think is it's there for the survival of the pathogen. And once the environmental conditions are appropriate, it's going to germinate. It's going to happen.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question we had, seeing soybeans flower so early, do you think we may need a third pass to prevent white mold, since each application gives us a 10 to 14 day coverage? My experience is we need to keep clean until the first week of August when flowering slows down. Any thoughts on that? And I can kind of give my thoughts, and maybe then Evelyn and Marc. So we've had some growers last year that did 3-pass systems in heavily white mold fields. In some cases, they did a variable rate fungicide for that third pass. If you take a look at, in general, and Evelyn, please comment on this, but our beans are flowering earlier and longer. And if we got the conditions that are out there, if you think back to that chart that I showed you for early planting, could be as long as 50 days. So, we could have 4 or 5 weeks or more of flowering. It may warrant in those really high pressure fields to have a 3-pass system. Again, I would probably look for that third pass if you got the capability of doing a variable rate fungicide. Evelyn and Marc, what's your thoughts?
Go ahead, Evelyn.
So I'm not an expert in crop protection or fungicide application, but I'll focus my answer on the disease side of things. If the conditions are appropriate, those sclerotia can be germinating, and those apothecia can be shooting ascospores for a longer time. So that's my take, right? You might have a higher risk or a longer, for a longer period of time of those flowers becoming more prone to receive those dying or dead flowers, to receiving those spores and initiating the disease. So I'll leave the fungicide application part to Marc. I don't want to get into that. Yeah.
Well, and based on what Paul's comments are, and some of those ideas, I think are newer, but I think they do have a lot of validity. I seen Bernie posing that question. I will compliment Bernie on years of experience and working with our products and through different conditions and different experiences based on when the solstice hits and our planting dates, and we are already seeing some early flowering taking place. And as it turns out, we're on this first day of the journey of days getting shorter, but they are long, and soybeans know it. So if we are going to get to August, it's not out of the question. I mean, obviously we've got labels that have, like for Acapella, up to 2 high rate applications per season. That's part on what the registration data, and I'm sure for many years working with a 3-week flowering period. Can it be longer than that? Yes, obviously it could be. We might be looking to protect 6 weeks. So again, economics, looking at yield potential, some things that I think Paul was alluding to, some whether it's variable rate or high infection, high field history, infection area, and may warrant staying at the higher rates, and especially if we've got some different modes of action that we're trying to work with. We've got one that maybe targets more of some of the leaf diseases as well with Viatude, so maybe position later R2 or more R3. But the Acapella obviously with plant health and that immediate effect on white mold control, again, part of a tool, part of many other. If we talk about 10 other management strategies leading up to that flowering period in managing soybeans, certainly can think about if we want to keep that protection at a very high level, because the dose does create that residual activity and movement within the plant. And so the higher rates obviously will help us get to that 12, 14 day period. But of course, when you have every single day on a 24-hour day that's giving you pressure and disease pressure on those petals that are within those leaf axils within the canopy already, that is the high priority. Of course, after that, we need good application technology to push fungicide well into the canopy as it develops, gets thicker, higher, and we need to get protection deeper into the canopy. So that's the other challenge obviously we have if we're talking about the multiple applications, but we have had a lot of success with 2. I think working with cooperators, and internally I think we can look at other opportunities and working with different modes of action to get that control we really want to protect those really high yielding soybeans.
Great. Thanks, Marc. Had a question come in. Is the Sporecaster app worth using? According to the app, my flowering field is high risk at 65% roughly. And again, I think it's a tool. I'm not going to say it's 100% accurate, but to me, it's going to get us into the ballpark. Am I a low a medium or a high risk. And then I would use weather data, your local conditions, the forecast, next 2-week forecast, humidity, rainfall, and all that together. So it's not perfect, but it gives us a good starting point for mold predictions. And then another question about growing degree units. Yeah, it's based on the growing degree units, the maximum temperature plus the minimum divided by 2 minus 50 in Fahrenheit, basically is how we're calculating those growing degree units. Marc, one here for you is, are both fungicides tank mixable with Roundup?
Yes, so Roundup or glyphosate, Acapella, Viatude are very compatible with glyphosate. Of course, we know that those fungicides are also very compatible with Enlist and the Enlist system as well. And we have had some success with a 3-way. Most of the time, glyphosate is the common partner because of the grass control and the odd time with a volunteer corn control product in a 3-way mix there. But yes, overall, very respect your your mixing order. But overall, the compatibility is excellent.
Okay, here's another question. I think more for you, Marc. Is it important when you apply a fungicide what's better, early morning, middle of the day, or in the evening, just as the sun goes down?
Well, for sure, you want to maximize the absorption. And Acapella works very quickly. Within an hour, it's basically absorbed within the plant. But those stomates, or those pores, much like our skin, we want them to be open and very accepting of the incoming fungicide and bring that into the plant as quickly as possible. So I think our humidity levels certainly help that. The heat is maybe a secondary factor. So we've had spraying take place from 4 a.m. till dark, and we've had a lot of success. So I think as long as stomates are open, we've got conditions that are very conducive to growing activity. It's a very much a green light with Acapella and Viatude for that matter. You make sure if you've got glyphosate and you're looking at weed control, it's also been very good. But some weeds, particularly lamb's quarters, a couple other broadleafs, when you think about it, you want to make sure that if you're timing that tank mix, for example, that those weeds have their leaves deployed and have not shut down in the heat of the day. And of course, we've been experiencing some 40-degree humidex. Probably that late morning to 4 or 5 in the afternoon, there's some growing points that are just not quite as susceptible. That would probably affect your herbicide or your glyphosate, for example, more so than the Acapella or the fungicide. One thing I would highlight too is when we're tank mixing with glyphosate, we want to be at least 15 gallons an acre. I'm not saying you need to go to 20, but coverage with Acapella and fungicides generally is key. So I would push it there. If you are using at least a liter, 1 rel or a minimum, but a 500 gram formulation of glyphosate, 1 liter. As far as the weed control has been very good, and I think we can push our water volumes to complement the labels of the fungicide.
All right. I don't see any other questions. So before I put up the CCA code, I'm going to launch one last question here, one last poll. So we hope this webinar assisted you with management decisions. Was the webinar useful? Yes, I hit on the key topics and issues on my farm. No, I wish we could get more in depth onto specific issues. And then just maybe. So just curious, folks, if we hit our target today with you, hopefully we did. If you could submit that. So we got so far 100%. That's a good thing. That means I think we did our job. So on behalf of myself, Marc, and Evelyn, I want to thank you for joining in. If you do have questions later on, later on today or tomorrow, whatever, you can send me an email or a phone or reach out to one of your Pioneer reps or anyone else. Again, there's the CCA scan code here. Hopefully, if you got that up on your app, you just scan that in with your phone, and that'll get you CCA credits for it. But on behalf of Pioneer Corteva, I want to thank you for your business. Thank you for joining in today. Hopefully, you found this webinar useful, and all the best here going forward. I see there might be one other chat that just maybe came in last minute. Just hold on here. I don't see unless Arlene or...
I think it was a poll.
Oh, okay. It was a poll. Sounds good. Anyway, thanks, folks. Happy Friday, and have a good weekend and best of the rest of the season for you.
Reach out anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.